Supreme War Scholar stepped into the center of the Grand War Council chamber. The circular room stretched high above him, with viewing platforms arranged in ascending rings where the most powerful military minds of the Empire watched and waited. He had spent 3 cycles preparing this presentation, 3 cycles studying humanity's wars, 3 cycles that had changed everything he thought he knew about conflict. The lights dimmed. The holographic display activated, projecting images above the chamber floor where all could see. His primary manipulator touched the control interface, and the first scene appeared. A trench, that's what humans called it. A long, narrow ditch carved into the earth, deep enough for their soldiers to stand without being seen. The walls were reinforced with wooden boards and sandbags. The floor was covered in wooden planks, though water and mud still seeped through. The image showed human soldiers standing in this hole, surrounded by dirt walls on 3 sides, the open sky above them. "This is from what humans call the Great War," began. His voice carried through the chamber's acoustic enhancement system. "It occurred in their years 1914 to 1918. The humans fought on a continent called Europe. This trench system stretched for over 400 of their miles. The war lasted 4 years. Approximately 20 million humans died." A counselor in the third ring shifted. 20 million for one continent. What strategic resource were they fighting over? His breathing apertures fluttered, a sign of unease. "That is part of what I need you to understand. The resources involved were modest. The territory gained was minimal. The humans were not fighting primarily for resources or land. They were fighting to break each other's will to continue fighting." He advanced the display. Now it showed an aerial view of the trench systems. They weren't simple lines. They were elaborate networks, zigzagging across the landscape in patterns that seemed almost decorative. Secondary trenches branched off from primary ones. Communication trenches ran perpendicular, connecting the front lines to rear positions. Underground bunkers dotted the system. It looked like a massive colony structure, except it was built for war. "The humans did not simply dig these ditches for cover," continued. "They designed them to be lived in. Soldiers remained in these trenches for weeks, sometimes months at a time. They ate there. They slept there. They developed diseases there. They watched their companions die there, and then they stayed longer." He showed the next image. A human soldier's feet, swollen and rotting, still inside deteriorating boots. The flesh was blackened and falling away. "This is what humans call trench foot. It occurs when their extremities remain wet and cold for extended periods. The tissue dies while they are still alive. It causes extreme pain. The humans knew this would happen when they designed their trench systems. They anticipated it. They considered it an acceptable consequence." A murmur rippled through the council chamber, pressed on. "But that is not the worst part. Watch this." The hologram shifted to show the area between opposing trenches. A barren stretch of churned earth, cratered and broken, stretched between 2 trench lines. Human soldiers climbed out of their trenches and began running across this space toward the enemy trenches. Immediately, weapons fire erupted from the opposing side. The humans fell, dozens at a time, hundreds, cut down by projectile weapons and explosive shells. The humans kept coming. More climbed from the trenches to replace those who had fallen. They ran across ground covered with the bodies of those who had tried moments before. They made it perhaps 20 meters before they too were cut down, and more came after them. "This is what humans call going over the top," said quietly. "They knew they would die. Their commanders knew they would die. They did it anyway. On one day of human battle at a place called the Somme, 60,000 humans became casualties in the first day. The offensive continued for months." The silence in the chamber was complete. Showed them barbed wire. Not simple barriers, but elaborate tangles of metal wire with sharp barbs stretched across the no-man's land between trenches. "This does not kill quickly," he explained. "It traps. A human soldier caught in this wire becomes stuck. They hang there, unable to advance or retreat while weapons fire tears into them. They scream for hours sometimes. Their companions in the trenches can hear them screaming. Some survive until night, crying for help that cannot come. The humans placed this wire, knowing exactly what it would do. More images followed. Artillery shells that burst above the ground, sending metal fragments downward into the trenches. Gas canisters that released chemicals which burned human lungs from the inside. Humans drowning in mud-filled shell craters. Humans with faces destroyed by close-range combat. Bodies hanging on wire. Bodies buried standing up in trench walls. Bodies everywhere, sometimes used as building materials because there were too many to remove. Analyze the pattern, said. Humans developed weapons not to kill efficiently but to maximize suffering. Artillery barrages were timed to wound rather than destroy completely. Wounded soldiers require resources to treat. They require other soldiers to carry them away from battle. They require transport and medical facilities. A wounded soldier demoralizes those around him more effectively than a corpse does. The humans understood this. They weaponized it. He showed them flame weapons, humans carrying devices that projected burning liquid onto other humans. The victims died slowly, in agony, their screams audible over battlefield noise. These weapons were not designed for efficiency, continued. Projectile weapons kill faster. These were designed specifically to make death horrible to witness, to traumatize the enemy, to make survivors afraid of facing the same fate. The War Council members were no longer shifting in their seats. They sat frozen, watching the horror unfold in the holographic display. Showed them rats. The trenches bred them in vast numbers. They fed on stored food, on garbage, and on the unburied dead. They grew large and bold. Human soldiers shared their living spaces with thousands of rats. They woke to find rats crossing their faces. They ate food that rats had contaminated. They developed diseases from rat bites, and they stayed in the trenches. The psychological effect was intentional, explained. Humans could have rotated soldiers more frequently. They could have built more sanitary positions. They chose not to. They understood that soldiers who endured these conditions became hardened. Those who survived developed a mental resilience that made them more effective in combat. The humans were not simply fighting their enemies. They were forging their own soldiers in a crucible of suffering. He showed them the Battle of Verdun, a single fortress complex where humans fought for 10 months. 300,000 humans died there. The battlefield was so saturated with explosives that the earth itself was nothing but shell craters. Trees were reduced to splinters. The ground was a mixture of mud, metal fragments, and human remains, and the humans kept fighting there for 10 months. The German human commander stated his objective explicitly, said. He wanted to bleed France white. Those were his words. His strategy was not to capture territory or destroy military capability. It was to kill so many French humans that France would lose the will to continue the war. This was considered sound military doctrine. The holographic display showed the aftermath. Humans standing in the ruins, covered in mud and blood, their eyes hollow. Young men who looked ancient. Survivors who would carry the trauma for the rest of their lives. And in their letters and diaries, which historians had preserved, many of these soldiers wrote that they would do it again if called upon. Turn to face the council directly. I have studied warfare across 43 species. I have analyzed conflicts spanning 2,000 years of galactic history. Never have I encountered a species that deliberately engineered suffering as a primary weapon. Most species fight to win. Humans fight to break their opponents by demonstrating their own willingness to endure anything. He paused, letting that sink in. Consider what this means for a military campaign against Earth. To defeat humans, we cannot simply destroy their fleets or occupy their territory. We must make them suffer so profoundly that they choose to surrender rather than continue fighting. But we have just seen what humans consider acceptable suffering. They sat in flooded holes for years. They charged into certain death by the thousands. They endured conditions that would break any soldier in days, and they did it for years. Another counselor spoke up. Surely this was an aberration, one war in their history. breathing apertures fluttered again. That was my hope when I began this research. It was not an aberration. I have prepared additional analysis covering 3,000 years of human warfare. The pattern is consistent. What I showed you today is not an exception. It is who humans are. The Grand War Council chamber remained silent for a long moment. Finally, the High Commander spoke. "What is your recommendation, War Scholar?" Looked up at the viewing platforms at the most powerful military minds of his civilization. Delay the invasion, indefinitely. We need to understand what we would be fighting before we commit to fighting it. These humans invented suffering as a weapon. They turned it against themselves as much as their enemies. I do not know if we can defeat a species like that. More importantly, I do not know if we can defeat them without becoming like them. And if we become like them to win, have we really won? The High Commander's silence stretched longer. Then, "Your recommendation is noted. Prepare a complete historical analysis. The Council will reconvene when your research is complete. Until then, all invasion planning is suspended." Bowed his acknowledgement. As the Council chamber began to empty, he remained standing in the center, the holographic display still showing those trenches, those humans standing in the mud, waiting for the next order to attack, waiting to suffer, waiting to make their enemies suffer more. He had begun this research confident that humanity would be an easy conquest. Now he was not sure they should be conquered at all, and that uncertainty terrified him more than any weapon he had ever studied. Commander Axe opened the sealed research vault with her personal access codes. Inside, centuries of intercepted human transmissions had been stored and cataloged. Radio broadcasts, television signals, digital communications, all of it captured by deep space monitoring arrays. Most of it had been ignored as cultural noise. Now Axe and her team would analyze every recorded human conflict with fresh eyes. They started at the beginning. Ancient warfare, from human civilizations that rose and fell before they developed advanced technology. The team gathered in the analysis chamber, displays arranged around them showing different eras of human history simultaneously. "These are Spartans," senior analyst said, highlighting a display. It showed human soldiers in bronze armor carrying shields and spears. They trained from childhood for war, but look at their formation tactics. The display showed hundreds of these soldiers packed tightly together, shields overlapping, spears extending forward. They call it a phalanx. Each soldier is pressed against those beside and behind him. When one soldier falls, the others see it happen within arm's reach. They step over their dying companions and maintain formation. Axe studied the formation. They designed it to maintain unit cohesion through shared trauma. Soldiers who watch their companions die at close range bond through that experience. "Exactly," confirmed. "And it gets worse. The Spartans practiced something called decimation. When a unit failed in battle, commanders would execute every 10th soldier, not the worst soldiers, random selection. The survivors had to watch their friends and colleagues die for a failure the entire unit shared. This was meant to enforce discipline." Another analyst spoke up from across the chamber. "The Romans expanded on these concepts. I am looking at their siege warfare tactics. At a city called Carthage, Roman forces besieged the city for 3 years. 3 years. Both sides knew what would happen. The defenders starved. Disease spread. They ate anything edible, then ate things that were not edible. The Romans sat outside and waited. When Carthage finally fell, the Romans killed or enslaved everyone, then burned the city and salted the earth so nothing would grow." "Why?" Axe asked. "If they wanted the territory, why destroy it so completely?" "They did not want the territory," replied. "They wanted other cities to know what happened when you fought Rome. They wanted the story of Carthage's suffering to spread, terror as a weapon." Axe moved to another display showing medieval human warfare, castles under siege, armies waiting outside for months or years. "These sieges could end quickly with a direct assault," she observed. "Why the prolonged blockades?" The analyst reviewing that era pulled up documentation. Starvation tactics. Humans discovered they could win sieges by making the defenders so desperate that surrender became preferable to continued resistance. There are records of sieges where trapped humans resorted to cannibalism. The attackers knew this was happening. They continued the siege anyway. Another display showed medieval torture devices, elaborate mechanisms designed to inflict pain without causing death. The analyst explaining them looked visibly disturbed. "These were not interrogation tools," she said. "I mean, they were used for that, but their primary purpose was public display. Humans would torture captives in city squares where everyone could watch. The torture would last days. The message was clear: resistance results in prolonged suffering." Axe moved through the centuries of warfare, her team presenting findings from each era. The pattern was consistent and becoming clearer. Humans did not fight just to win. They fought to demonstrate capacity for inflicting and enduring suffering. "Show me more recent conflicts," she ordered, "after their industrial revolution." The displays shifted. Mechanized warfare. World War I appeared again, but now her team showed the broader context. World War II followed. The scale was staggering. 60 million human dead, entire cities destroyed, industrial facilities converted to manufacture weapons, human economies reorganized around total war. "Look at this," said, highlighting a particular battle. Stalingrad, a single city. The Germans and Russians fought there for 5 months, over 2 million casualties. The city was reduced to rubble. Soldiers fought floor by floor through destroyed buildings. The average life expectancy of a Russian soldier upon arriving in Stalingrad was less than 1 day. They kept sending soldiers anyway. Axe stared at the statistics. Unacceptable losses. Why did they not withdraw? "Because humans do not calculate acceptable losses the way we do," replied. "To them, the psychological impact of holding or taking a position can outweigh the casualties required." Stalingrad became a symbol. Both sides fed soldiers into the battle not because the city had strategic value, but because losing it would mean something psychologically. Brought up another conflict. Vietnam. The Americans fought there for years. They had superior technology, superior firepower, overwhelming advantages, but the Vietnamese used tactics specifically designed to negate those advantages. Booby traps hidden everywhere, ambushes, hit-and-run attacks, nothing designed to win a conventional battle, everything designed to inflict steady casualties and break American will to continue fighting. The display showed some of these traps, pits with sharpened stakes, mines rigged to maim rather than kill. "These were engineered for maximum trauma," explained. "A dead soldier is replaced. A wounded soldier who screams for hours before dying traumatizes everyone who hears it." The Vietnamese understood this. They calculated that psychological damage was more valuable than kill counts. Axe pulled up casualty statistics from various human wars. The numbers were incomprehensible. Millions dead in single conflicts, tens of millions across multiple wars, and humans kept fighting new wars despite knowing the costs. "Do they not learn?" she asked. "Do they not adapt?" "They do learn," said, "but not the lesson we would expect. Watch this." He showed footage from something humans called the Battle of the Somme. British soldiers climbing from trenches, walking toward German machine guns, dying by the thousands. The British commanders knew this tactic was not working. They had clear evidence from the first day. 60,000 casualties in 1 day. They continued the offensive for months with the same tactics. "That is insanity." "No," corrected. "That is human military doctrine. They call it attrition warfare. The goal is not to break through enemy lines. The goal is to kill so many enemy soldiers that the enemy loses the capacity to continue fighting." The British accepted massive casualties because they believed Germany would run out of soldiers first. They were betting on their ability to endure suffering longer than their opponent. Axe accessed the analysis her team had compiled on human psychology, reports on what humans called post-traumatic stress, the long-term psychological damage caused by combat. Humans studied this extensively. They knew exactly what warfare did to their soldiers' minds. They sent them anyway. Look at their literature, another analyst suggested. Their poetry, their stories about war. Axe pulled up a selection. Human poetry written by soldiers in trenches. Stories of war passed down through generations. Songs about battles. The pattern was disturbing. Humans romanticized war even as they depicted its horrors. They wrote about the suffering with a strange mixture of revulsion and pride. They celebrated survival. They honored those who endured the worst conditions. They commemorate suffering, Axe said slowly. They build monuments to their wars. They have holidays to remember their dead. They turn their trauma into cultural touchstones. Yes, agreed. And that makes them more dangerous. They are not just willing to suffer. They take pride in having suffered. A soldier who survives a terrible battle wants to forget it. A human soldier who survives wants others to know what they endured. Axe spent days reviewing the material. Her team compiled thousands of examples across human history. Different cultures, different continents, different eras. The details varied, but the core pattern remained constant. Humans understood that warfare was partly physical and partly psychological. They developed doctrines that targeted both simultaneously. They were willing to sacrifice their own soldiers' physical and mental health to break enemy morale. A junior analyst presented findings on something called the Siege of Leningrad. The German army surrounded this Russian city for over 2 years, he explained. They cut off food supplies. Over 1 million civilians starved to death. The Russians knew what was happening. They could have evacuated or surrendered. They chose to endure, to wait for relief. They ate paste made from wallpaper. They ate leather. They ate anything remotely organic. Some resorted to cannibalism, and they held the city. Why? Axe demanded. What possible strategic value justified that suffering? Psychological value, the analyst replied. If Leningrad surrendered, it would signal that starvation siege tactics worked. Other cities would face the same approach. By holding out despite the horror, Leningrad forced the Germans to maintain a massive siege force for years. Those forces could not be used elsewhere. The suffering had strategic purpose. Axe reviewed the final compilations. Her team had identified what they called human doctrines of warfare, terms like total war, war of annihilation, mutual assured destruction, scorched earth. Each doctrine recognized that winning sometimes required being willing to lose everything. She prepared her report for the Grand War Council. The conclusion was unavoidable. Humans had spent thousands of years refining the art of inflicting and enduring suffering. They taught it in their military academies. They studied historical examples to improve their methods. They passed lessons down through generations. This was not aberrant behavior by one civilization in one era. This was fundamental to how humans understood conflict. The presentation to the council took 6 hours. Axe showed them everything. Ancient battles where humans fought in formations designed to maximize shared trauma. Medieval sieges that lasted years. Industrial age conflicts where casualties were measured in millions. Modern warfare where humans developed weapons capable of destroying their entire species. The humans call it mutually assured destruction, Axe explained. They built enough nuclear weapons to render their planet uninhabitable. Both major powers could destroy each other completely, and for decades they maintained this readiness, knowing that using these weapons would end their civilization. They were willing to commit species suicide rather than submit to their enemies. The council chamber was absolutely silent. My recommendation, Axe said, is that Earth be classified as a prohibited engagement zone, not because we cannot defeat humans militarily. Our technology is superior. Our fleets are stronger. In a conventional war, we would likely win. But winning a war against humans requires being willing to match their capacity for suffering. It requires being willing to feed soldiers into meat grinders for years. It requires being willing to sacrifice millions to break their will. It requires becoming what they are. She paused, looking up at the council members. I do not believe our civilization can do that. More importantly, I do not believe we should try. The humans have been preparing for wars like this for their entire history. We have not. They have cultural and psychological adaptations to prolonged suffering that we lack. If we invade Earth, we will either lose or we will have to adopt their methods of warfare. If we adopt their methods, we will have to become like them to win. And I am not certain that victory would be worth the transformation it would require. The High Commander considered this for a long moment. You are recommending we abandon conquest of Earth not because we cannot win, but because winning would damage us irreparably. Yes, Commander, that is exactly what I am recommending. Another long silence. The Council will deliberate, the High Commander finally said. In the meantime, all invasion planning remains suspended. Commander Axe, your analysis has been noted and will be given full consideration. As the council chamber emptied, Axe remained at the display controls. She pulled up one final image. Human soldiers from various eras standing together in a digital composite. Ancient warriors with bronze shields, medieval knights, soldiers from the world wars, modern troops. All of them shared that same look. That hollowness in the eyes that came from seeing and surviving horrors. That expression that said they had been through the worst and survived it and would do it again if necessary. She had studied warfare for her entire career. She had never encountered anything like humanity. They terrified her, not because they were strong, but because they had made themselves strong through deliberate exposure to suffering. They had forged themselves in crucibles of their own design, generation after generation, until enduring the unendurable became part of their identity. And if they invaded Earth, they would have to match that. She could not imagine her people doing that. She could not imagine wanting them to try. Junior strategist La sat alone in the archive chamber, reviewing the same material her superiors had analyzed. She had read its initial report. She had studied Axe's comprehensive historical analysis. Both reports concluded that humans were too dangerous, too willing to suffer, too fundamentally broken in ways that made them nearly undefeatable. She thought they had missed something important. La pulled up footage from the Great War again. The trenches, the suffering, the senseless charges into machine gun fire. It was horrifying. But then she looked at what came after. The war ended in 1918. By 1919, humans were already calling it the war to end all wars. They built monuments, yes, but monuments that mourned rather than celebrated. They wrote poetry and novels that depicted war as a nightmare rather than a glory. She found records of something called the League of Nations. Humans created it immediately after the Great War, trying to build a system to prevent future conflicts. It failed, which led to another massive war, but the impulse was significant. After inflicting and enduring horrific suffering, humans tried to create mechanisms to prevent it from happening again. After World War II, they created the United Nations. They wrote the Geneva Conventions. They established international laws against certain weapons and tactics. They prosecuted their own soldiers for war crimes. These were not the actions of a species that loved suffering. These were the actions of a species terrified of their own capacity for it. La dug deeper. She found human films, television programs, books. The most popular human stories were not about glorious conquests. They were about people trying to prevent wars, about soldiers questioning orders, about the costs of conflict. Humans created entire genres of entertainment centered on the message that war was terrible and should be avoided. Their most celebrated leaders were often those who found ways to avoid conflicts. Their most honored soldiers were frequently those who saved lives rather than took them. Their most powerful cultural myths involved sacrifice for others rather than victory over enemies. She pulled up recent human history conflicts from the past century. The pattern had changed. Wars were shorter. Casualties were lower. Humans still fought, but they fought differently. They established rules of engagement. They tried to minimize civilian casualties. They sent aid to defeated enemies rather than destroying them completely. The atomic weapons particularly interested her. Humans had used them twice, seen the results, and then never used them again despite fighting multiple wars over the following decades. They possessed weapons capable of ending conflicts instantly and chose not to use them. That was not the behavior of a species that weaponized suffering for its own sake. La compiled her findings into a counter-analysis. She requested time before the Grand War Council, knowing her low rank made it unlikely she would be heard. To her surprise, the request was granted. The council wanted to hear dissenting views before making a final decision. She stood in the same chamber where an axe had presented their reports. The council members watched her with skeptical attention. A junior strategist challenging the conclusions of senior war scholars was almost unprecedented. "I believe we have misunderstood humanity," La began. "Not factually. Everything in the previous reports is accurate. Humans are capable of extraordinary suffering. They have built military doctrines around it. They have endured and inflicted horrors that no could imagine tolerating. But we have misinterpreted what that means." She brought up images from human culture, hospitals, schools, aid organizations. For every image of human warfare, there are thousands of images like these. Humans building rather than destroying, helping rather than harming, creating systems to care for the wounded, educate the young, feed the hungry. They do not spend most of their time making each other suffer. They spend most of their time trying to reduce suffering. A council member interrupted. "But when they do fight, they become what we have seen. That is what matters for invasion planning." "Yes," La agreed. "When they fight, they are terrible, but consider why they fight the way they do. They did not develop their capacity for suffering because they enjoy it. They developed it because they are terrified of being conquered. Every human civilization that failed to develop this capacity was conquered by those who did. The humans who survived were those who proved willing to endure anything to prevent subjugation." She showed them the aftermath of human wars. "Look at what they do when the fighting ends. After World War II, the Americans helped rebuild Japan and Germany, the nations that had been their enemies. They could have destroyed them completely. Instead, they invested resources in reconstruction. They turned enemies into allies." More images followed. The European Union, former enemies cooperating economically. The United Nations, flawed but attempting to create dialogue between rivals. International aid organizations, often providing help to nations that had recently been adversaries. "This is not the behavior of a species that views suffering as a tool," La argued. "This is the behavior of a species that knows what suffering looks like and actively tries to prevent it." She brought up the Geneva Conventions. After experiencing total war, humans created international laws to limit it. They banned certain weapons. They established rules for treatment of prisoners. They made it illegal to deliberately target civilians. They prosecute their own soldiers who violate these rules. A species that weaponizes suffering would not create and enforce laws against it. Present in the council chamber spoke up. "But they break those laws when convenient. They still fight wars. They still inflict casualties." "Yes," La acknowledged. "But the direction of change matters. Compare human warfare from 1,000 years ago to human warfare today. The trend is toward less suffering, not more. Shorter conflicts, fewer civilian casualties, greater concern for humanitarian impact. They have not stopped fighting, but they have consistently tried to make fighting less horrible." She pulled up human literature again, but different selections than her predecessors had shown. Anti-war poetry, novels depicting the trauma and waste of conflict, films showing war as tragedy rather than adventure. Human culture does not celebrate suffering. It mourns it. Their most powerful war memorials are not triumphant monuments. They are walls engraved with names of the dead, graves marked with identical stones stretching into the distance, eternal flames burning in memory of those lost. They remember suffering not to glorify it, but to remind themselves never to repeat it. The council chamber was quiet, but La could sense uncertainty rather than dismissal. "Here is what I believe we have missed," she continued. "Humans did not invent suffering as a weapon. They invented themselves as weapons, and suffering was the forge. But unlike a blade that exists only to cut, humans retain the capacity to choose what they aim themselves at. They can be terrible in war because they have to be, but they would prefer not to be." She showed them more recent human space exploration efforts, cooperative projects between nations that had been enemies decades earlier, plans for missions to other planets that involved multinational crews, humans reaching outward together rather than fighting over there. "If we invade Earth, we will face the worst of humanity. They will fight with everything they have. They will endure suffering we cannot imagine enduring. They will make us suffer in return. Both civilizations will be damaged, perhaps irreparably. But if we approach them as potential allies rather than targets for conquest, we might access the other side of humanity, the side that builds rather than destroys, the side that chose to limit atomic weapons rather than use them freely, the side that helps former enemies rebuild." La brought up her final display. It showed human casualty statistics across time, declining despite increasing populations and more advanced weapons. "The trend is clear. Humans are learning. Slowly, imperfectly, but learning. They are trying to move away from the horrors they are capable of inflicting. We should help them move in that direction rather than forcing them back toward total war." She took a breath before her conclusion. "I recommend we reclassify Earth as a potential ally rather than a conquest target, not because we cannot defeat them. We probably can, but because defeating them would require matching their capacity for suffering, and that would change us into something we should not want to become. Meanwhile, befriending them gives us access to everything that capacity represents without requiring us to replicate it ourselves." The council chamber remained silent for a long moment. Then the High Commander spoke. "You are suggesting we ally with humans specifically because they are terrifying in war." "Yes, Commander. A species that can do what humans did in those trenches, learn from it, and then choose to limit their own violence afterward, is either the most valuable ally or the most dangerous enemy in the galaxy. I would prefer to find out which is friends rather than invaders." Stood from his observer position. "May I speak, Commander?" The High Commander gestured assent. "Junior Strategist La has challenged my conclusions," said. "I should be offended. Instead, I am relieved. She is correct. I focused on human capacity for warfare without properly analyzing their capacity for restraint. Both exist. Both matter." Axe also rose to speak. "I concur. My analysis showed that humans are dangerous, but dangerous can be useful if directed properly. A blade is dangerous, but that is why we carry one. Perhaps humanity is the galaxy's blade, forged in suffering, capable of cutting through any problem but requiring a steady hand to wield responsibly." The High Commander considered this. "You are all recommending the same course of action from different reasoning. Avoid military conflict with Earth. But Junior Strategist, you go further. You recommend active alliance." "Yes, Commander," La confirmed. "Humans have something we lack. They have learned to endure and overcome challenges that would destroy us. If there are threats in the galaxy that require that kind of resilience, we want humans facing those threats with us, not against us." The High Commander rose from his seat. The entire council stood in response. "The council has heard all arguments. We will now deliberate. War Scholar, Commander Axe, Junior Strategist La, you are all to be commended for thorough analysis. Your recommendations carry weight in our decision." The formal pronouncement indicated the end of presentations. As the council members filed out to their deliberation chambers, La found herself standing next to. "I expected you to argue against my conclusions," she said quietly. His breathing apertures fluttered in what might have been amusement. "I am a scholar, not a politician. I seek truth, not validation. You found truth I missed. That is how scholarship should work." Axe joined them. The council will accept our recommendations. The war party wanted to hear dissenting views precisely because they are uncertain. Your perspective provides them a path forward that does not require admitting we are afraid to fight. Are we, La asked, afraid to fight them? Yes, Axe said bluntly, and we should be. Fear of a dangerous opponent is wisdom, not cowardice. The three of them stood in the empty council chamber, waiting. Hours passed. Finally, the council reconvened. The High Commander took his position at the center of the chamber. The Grand War Council has reached a decision regarding Earth and humanity, he announced. All invasion planning is permanently canceled. Earth is hereby classified as a potential ally civilization. We will initiate contact through diplomatic channels. We will offer cooperation in space exploration and scientific research. We will propose mutual defense agreements. He paused, looking directly at La. We will do this not because we fear humanity, though we respect their capabilities. We will do this because, as junior strategist La observed, a species that can forge themselves in suffering and then choose mercy is precisely the kind of ally we need. The High Commander's gaze swept across the chamber. We will approach humanity with honesty. We will tell them we studied their wars. We will tell them we concluded they could not be conquered without unacceptable cost. We will tell them we chose alliance over enmity. And we will hope they appreciate honesty more than flattery. He turned to War Scholar. You will lead the first contact team. Your understanding of human warfare will be valuable in communicating with their military leaders. Commander Axe will serve as military liaison. Junior strategist.